Hey guys, it's your tired teacher back again, and man, I didn't get much sleep last night. But anyways, today we're talking about LBJ, and LBJ is one of my favorite presidents to cover because this dude has so much going on. Uh, let's just put it to you guys this way. If you guys thought FDR did a lot of stuff, let's just say FDR was this guy's hero, and he wanted to live up to every bit of FDR's legacy. So, if that's any indication of how much stuff we need to cover under LBJ, holy crap, guys. We've got so much to cover. So, let's go ahead and dive in and cover LBJ's programs. So, this is a condensed version of the PowerPoint that I have, guys. So, when we do get to his presidential programs, it's going to be a table that you guys are going to see, and we're going to cover each program one by one on that table. So when we get to that point, it's going to take a long time because, dude, he did a lot. So yeah, that's why we're going with the condensed version of this PowerPoint, just to save on slides here, even though it probably doesn't matter on a video, but whatever. Let's just go with this. So we're going to cover LBJ's domestic policy today and civil rights, and I think I'm going to hold off LBJ's foreign policy and the end of his presidency for next video, because I'm telling you guys, this guy is one of those presidents that you need to know. I mean, he ranks up there with FDR as far as importance of what he does. The likes of Teddy Wilson, just people have done a lot of stuff, all right? So he's one of these presidents that you need to know for AP and EOC. So LBJ is actually a Texas guy. Yeah. He is our first president from Texas, and LBJ is a master politician. This guy knows politics. He knows how to work it, and that is his biggest strength. So here's LBJ. He's our 36th president, and this guy was a teacher. Yeah. I'll show you guys a picture of his class that he taught in Cotulla, Texas. But he served in the Navy during World War II. He was elected to 6 terms in the House before becoming elected to the Senate. He became the youngest majority leader in U.S. history. Bruh. This guy's congressional legacy would have already put him in the history books. His presidency is really where he does so much for civil rights and to try to end the war on poverty. This guy, man, this guy does a lot. So, his presidential legacy is massive. Now, let's go ahead and continue. There is a young LBJ meeting his hero, FDR, and I forget who the dude in the middle standing awkwardly between the bromance is. But, alright. So since FDR is his hero, he wants to do the same kind of dynamic social reforms that FDR did during the New Deal. And so during his 30 years in Congress, this guy learns everything about Congress. I mean, this guy is able to push legislation through Congress like nobody's business, and that helps him so much when passing civil rights in a time where Southern Democrats had key positions in Congress where they could have easily shot down these bills. LBJ was able to push them through. And that right there is what separates him from JFK. JFK did not have that same political savvy that LBJ does, and so he often couldn't get stuff past Congress. But LBJ, man, gets the wheels in motion. He gets everything working in his favor. And he's going to pass Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill in 1964, and then a couple of his own subsequently. And he also persuades Congress to pass Kennedy's income tax cut. So, I mean, yeah, this guy gets stuff done. So he's going to really, really be one to try to use his experience to benefit society. I mean, this guy wants to do some good. So, how we see a big piece of that play out is, his war on poverty. And he tackles this war on poverty because not only is he influenced by people like Michael Harrington and, his novel about poverty in America. So, what LBJ is also influenced by is his time as a teacher. So this is when he taught the 5th, 6th, and 7th grades in Cotulla, Texas in 1928. That's his class. So here's what he had to say about his time teaching. I could never forget seeing the disappointment in their eyes and seeing the quizzical expression on their faces when they had to come to school, most of them without breakfast, most of them hungry. You never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the face of a young child. So right there, his experience as a teacher is going to help push him to want to do better for people, minorities and the poor. Because the class that he taught, I'm not sure if you guys can tell there, but it's a largely Hispanic class. So he is going to be definitely a champion for the poor and minorities. And his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, is going to be a champion for environmental measures. So he finishes out JFK's term, all right? And then, which is just a couple months remaining. So he has to run for re-election. And who he's running against in 1964 is Barry Goldwater, who's a very tough on communist guy, but this guy also is wanting to use nukes in things like the raging Vietnam War. So Goldwater definitely transforms the Republican Party. This guy is more of your modern day Republican in the likes of Reagan. That we'll see play out later with his presidency that starts up in 1980. Goldwater is more of a small government guy. He doesn't think the federal government should work to solve social and economic issues. It should be left up to the states. So he believes like programs like Social Security should be privatized. Tennessee Valley Authority should be sold. There shouldn't be like big federal programs like that. And Goldwater wants the Get Tough policy to be played out against Cuba, North Vietnam, and basically kind of going more towards like the massive retaliation and brinkmanship of Dulles. This guy is kind of more down with that type of policy instead of stuff like flexible response. So people are going to be concerned that he's going to use nukes. Now, LBJ is going to campaign on like Kennedy's popularity plus his own platform, and by painting Barry Goldwater as an extremist. So LBJ is pushing environmental issues, social issues, educational programs, because he's already kind of started his war on poverty by this point in time in his Great Society in the last couple of months of JFK's presidency. So, I mean, he's already starting to push that agenda for him. So he's campaigning on that. Plus, he wants to seem tough on communism. And by this point in time, the Gulf of Tonkin incident had already happened. So when we get to Vietnam, guys, with his foreign policy, I'll explain it a bit later. But we start getting involved more and more in Vietnam. And so Congress is going to pass a Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which increases their involvement in Vietnam. Now, as far as painting Goldwater as an extremist that'll use nukes and reverse like some of the New Deal programs that are still in existence, and he also kind of painted Goldwater as like opposed to civil rights. So in order to gain more of the African American vote for LBJ. And the African American community will definitely definitely support LBJ's presidency because of his civil rights measures that we will see play out. So, oh my God, you guys should look this up. Or you know what? It's short enough for me to play in class, so I think at this point in time I would probably pause and play this in class. But he has one of the most controversial campaign ads in history. And this is one that convinces people not to vote for Barry Goldwater, because you see that adorable little girl right there on top. She's basically pulling the petals off of a daisy. And that's why we call her the Daisy Girl. So this ad only airs once on NBC. The Goldwater camp is really opposed to this ad because the ad shows this young girl while she's pulling the petals from the daisy. Once she gets to the last petal, this is when a nuclear bomb explodes. We see the mushroom cloud, and then we hear LBJ's voice saying, "These are the stakes: to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the darkness. We must either love each other or we must die." And then it says, "Hey, vote for LBJ. The consequences are too high if you don't." And holy crap. It gets the job done. People are like, "Oh no, we need to not vote for Barry Goldwater." And so LBJ is going to clean house, man, when it comes to the electoral votes. But notice how the Solid South has voted against LBJ because civil rights. So this is a point in time when the South starts to flip Republican. Because it had been the Solid South as Democrat since God before the Civil War. But now, because of the issue of civil rights, the South flips. So as far as like the impact of the election, LBJ is going to really do a whole bunch of sweeping reform. Yeah, he even wins by a larger margin than FDR did against Alf Landon in 1936 when FDR was ultra popular. So this was before court packing scheme. I mean, FDR's popularity was at its height in 36 and LBJ beat that. So he also has a supermajority in Congress. I mean, he controls 2/3 of both houses. And this allows LBJ to go ahead and push through his Great Society programs. So he doesn't have to worry about appeasing the Southern members of Congress. So he can just like push on through with stuff like civil rights, his war on poverty, and other Great Society programs. But the South defecting to the Republican Party is definitely the biggest takeaway from this politically, because we do see that shift happen in this election in 1960, and for here on out, even till present day, the Solid South is largely Republican. So Goldwater tries to get like young conservatives into this brand of conservatism that they have now. These new conservative voices like Ronald Reagan will get involved. And so if anything, Barry Goldwater had a huge impact on the Republican Party's future. And so they're going to start taking on these more like, tough on communist stances. And they're going to greatly depart from the likes of what we saw under Eisenhower's Republican presidency and what we will even see with Richard Nixon's Republican presidency. Once we get to Reagan and we do see these Goldwater conservatives rise up, you're going to notice a shift. So keep that in mind, guys, for when we cover Reagan, which will probably be next week because we seriously don't have enough time. Oh, Lord. Okay. All right. We got no time. Let's continue. So LBJ's program is a great society. And here's his quote where he basically outlines it in the University of Michigan's May commencement speech in '64. So a lot of these came from JFK, but JFK didn't have the political savvy to get them through Congress, but LBJ does. So think of it as kind of like continuing JFK's legacy, but LBJ is definitely putting his mark on history by going above and beyond what JFK would have done with this. So, your imagination, your initiative, and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. So like we said, the Great Society is going to tackle this war on poverty. And JFK was influenced by Michael Harrington, and so is LBJ. When they read his book, The Other America, Poverty in the United States, remember how we said the 50s, when we have this stereotypical view of the 50s, is like, oh yeah, white suburbia America. This book right here shows the other half, essentially. So it's kind of like what Jacob Riis did with How the Other Half Lives, but this guy is going to, focus more on like the inner city and those poor and stuff. So he uses case studies to say that there were tens of thousands of Americans who were trapped in the culture of poverty and they had no way out. And he's basically pushing Congress to really address the issue and not turn the blind eye to those who are poor in this country. So JFK is moved by this book, and he's like, yeah, we need to tackle this problem. So he wants to start up a war on poverty, but of course the assassination happens, and LBJ takes up the mantle and integrates it into his great society. So, yeah. It helped that he was in the Senate for so long. As majority leader, he got a lot of political clout out of that. And he's going to really get this show on the road, man. His war on poverty, his Great Society programs, like we said, FDR is his hero. He wants a new deal. So the Great Society is LBJ's New Deal. Here we go, buddy. Here we go, guys. Oh, okay. Brace yourselves, because we've got 1, 2, 3. And that's not all his programs. I am just highlighting the important ones. All right? So, okay, here we go. Let's go on down the line. We've got the years right here, so you could see when they're all enacted. Let's go on with the Economic Opportunity Act. So, of course, this is going to tackle the war on poverty. He's going to create programs such as Job Corps, which think of it as kind of like the WPA back in New Deal times, right? During the Great Depression. Stuff like that. That'll help, with job placement, with doing infrastructure work and whatnot. Getting skills for, like, industrial jobs. Vista is basically kind of like including stuff like Peace Corps kind of measures, but the important thing about Vista is that it's going to include stuff like AmeriCorps, which is going to also have under its umbrella stuff like Teach for America, which we get people who come straight out of college with their degrees. They get a temporary teaching license. They need to teach for 2 years, and then their loans and stuff will be forgiven. And this is to help tackle, the shortage on educators in this country. And another thing, because, LBJ knows the key to getting out of poverty is education. He wants to start young. So Project Head Start is going to be kind of like this pre-K, pre-K, I guess, kind of program where he's going to set up Project Head Start schools in poor areas of the country so that these kids can get a head start on their education and therefore be more successful overall throughout their educational career, which will lead to greater educational opportunities like in college and, getting a better job. So as far as like direct relief programs, we've got the Food Stamp Act, we got Medicare and Medicaid. As far as like, aiding people with, food and with medical care. So these are some of the biggest programs that LBJ sets up. And with the Food Stamp Act in 64, he's going to expand the program to help the poor buy food. Because, I mean, like we heard from his quote about his students that he taught, always coming to school hungry, he wants to address that. He wants to make sure that people have food to eat. I know programs like food stamps are controversial today because a lot of people think that there are abuses that happen. But, you know, when it was first set up, LBJ's goal was to make sure that kids just don't go hungry. And so in order to do that, I mean, yeah, people receive a stipend for food each month if they meet certain income requirements. So beyond the modern day controversies of this program, I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to the core, to get people access to food. Now, in Medicare and Medicaid, this is providing insurance to both old people and to people who are poor or disabled and whatnot. So here's an easy way to tell the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. We care for old people. We aid the poor and disabled. So Medicare is going to be for 65 and up. And I mean, yeah, this complements stuff like Social Security very well. Of course, we're going to use tax money to pay for health insurance for older Americans. And then with Medicaid, Medicaid is going to help offer medical care for the poor and the disabled. So here we go, expanding access to health care. LBJ back in the day was one of these presidents who unsuccessfully tried to pass, something that Obama did with the Affordable Care Act and like health care reform. So he's one of the long string of presidents who actually tried this. Teddy had tried it. Wilson had tried it. Truman had tried it. FDR had tried it. LBJ tried it. Even Richard Nixon later had tried it. And Clinton had tried to pass healthcare reform. So when President Obama was able to successfully pass that during his presidency, it was a big deal. But LBJ does pass Medicare and Medicaid through Congress, which is huge in helping those portions of society gain medical care. Another thing that's going to try to tackle the war on poverty is by developing the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So with this new cabinet position, we're going to administer new federal housing programs to help aid the poor and those who can't otherwise afford housing, amongst other things. What we saw during FDR's presidency with FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, is going to be under this new department. So under the Department of Housing and Urban Development, what LBJ is going to start doing is setting up project housing, which is housing for low-income people, and it's government housing, essentially. So he also cares about the arts and the humanities and sets up the National Foundation on Arts and the Humanities. And so it's going to provide federal funding for the arts and creative and scholarly projects. So this is the reason why we have stuff like PBS. And this is the reason why we have stuff like Sesame Street. Yes, this is exactly why. And in fact, Sesame Street starts up around this time in the 60s as a direct result. So yeah. LBJ cares about a lot of different societal things. And, by funding stuff like PBS, it also furthers his educational agenda. With the Immigration Act, he's going to be more open to immigration. He's going to abolish the discriminatory quotas that are based on national origins that we had instituted since the 20s. He's going to get rid of that and open it up to where it's easier for immigrants to come into America and gain citizenship. Okay, let's continue with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So this is in 1965. And of course, his teacher background, this is right up his alley. But here's the thing. The reason why schools and poor areas of the country get funding to help them stay afloat and compete with other areas of the country is because of this. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act sets up stuff like Title I, which provides federal funds to poor school districts like our own. And so it's going to fund even special education programs. Funds are going to be pushed to Project Head Start. And really, this opens up the door for poor areas of the country to start gaining more of an educational footing and puts them more on par with other areas of the country who can rely on their property taxes for their education. But of course, in poor areas, it can't do that. So there's always been like shortfalls when it comes to funding. But now with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, additional federal funds are sent to these areas so they can compete. We also have the Higher Education Act, and this is going to provide scholarships and grants for college students. So Pell Grants, subsidized and unsubsidized loans. I mean, financial aid, guys. Okay, financial aid. That's what he essentially sets up. So it makes it possible for low-income students to finance their education and not have to, like, go to the Army or the military and take advantage of the GI Bill. So, I mean, he wanted to provide another avenue for the poor to access higher education. And definitely, we are appreciative of this. Yeah. You guys may be on the receiving end of it later, So, definitely preach on that one. Okay. Now, here's where Lady Bird's environmental measures start to pour in with the Clean Air Act amendment. So we're going to establish emission standards for cars so that they're not throwing up as much like smog and smoke and like just bad stuff into the atmosphere. So we're going to set up those standards. And the Department of Transportation is also set up as well because we need to work on our infrastructure. We need to work on public transportation. So it's going to deal with air travel, rail travel, highway transportation. All of that is going to be organized now under the Department of Transportation. And I think the country is already like taken over Amtrak by this point in time. Yeah, the trains, guys, are run by the country. They're run by Amtrak. So I think that happens around this time. It may have happened earlier under FDR, but somebody correct me in the comments. All right. Child Nutrition Act. So this is going to add breakfast to the school lunch program. Remember, FDR had set up the school lunch program as part of his New Deal initiatives with the National Youth Administration, which was under the WPA umbrella. So LBJ takes it a step further and says, yeah, lunch. All right, we're going to add to lunch with breakfast. So that's the food program now. So that's why cafeterias service breakfast and lunch now. All right, the Truth in Packaging Act. So if you guys have food allergies or anything like that, thank you, some LBJ, because he sets the standards for labeling consumer products now that they have to say, oh yeah, this uses peanuts and soy and, other milk and other allergens. All right. So this kind of gets that settled. And remember, it's pretty much building on what we saw at Teddy with the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act, where there's like now defining standards set up by like the FDA and whatnot as far as like what can go into our food. Now we are seeing exactly what goes in by reading the labels. So good deal. All right. Here's some more stuff, guys. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Oh, like what we were saying earlier when we were talking about the National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is PBS, all right? So, of course, it's going to feature programming from the National Foundation of Arts and the Humanities. So, it's educational television, public and free, and radio broadcasting as well, so that, there could be greater access to educational programming for the entire country. So PBS, Sesame Street, Yes. All right. So, more stuff. So in addition to all these programs that we just saw, Congress increases funding for mass transit, public housing, rent subsidies for low-income people, crime prevention, and Ralph Nader, with his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, is going to persuade Congress to pass regulations on the automobile industry, like to make seatbelts mandatory in cars. Okay? Yeah, because they were not mandatory. So, thank you, some Ralph Nader, for keeping us safe. All right. And Lady Bird is going to take up the whole federal parks initiatives, wilderness areas, pushing for that. Well, for her husband to push for that. And to improve the environment overall. Beautify America. So, Highway Beautification Act. We're going to try to clean up the countryside. So, dipping more into these programs once again, because we just did a great overview on this. So here is more about the war on poverty. So again, we're tackling this through stuff like Project Head Start, Job Corps. Your work study programs are also set up under the Economic Opportunity Act. So work study programs is another form of financial aid for poor university students to, help finance their education. They work on campus, and that pay is worked into the financial aid package so that they can help pay for school. So VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America, merges with the National Civilian Community Corps to form AmeriCorps. So that's the newest version of VISTA. And it's a domestic version of the Peace Corps, so it's basically people doing stuff to benefit America. And one of the things, of course, is Teach for America. So Neighborhood Youth Corps is going to provide basic education and adult job training. So it's kind of like the National Youth Administration that we saw under FDR's New Deal. CAPS, Community Action Program, is going to try to get maximum feasible participation by poor people to determine what would help them the most. And so it's going to be totally different from how we ran social reform programs in the past. And of course, food stamps program that we already discussed. So more about the elementary and secondary education bill. So again, it's going to set up Title I, which is how poor school districts around the country are able to meet funding, for their schools to help them operate in areas where there's obviously a lot of low income. So, children under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, there's going to be more educational services for children of low-income homes than for children from affluential homes. Again, to try to close that gap between rich and poor. So, all right. And with Medicare, we could see President Truman's actually the first one to get Medicare. So, again, this is old age medical insurance and for the disabled. So as far as the environment goes, people like Rachel Carson are going to definitely influence people like LBJ and his wife Lady Bird with her book, The Silent Spring. So DDT is a pesticide, which is pretty harmful. And so she's exposing what it did to the environment and what it even does to people. So even though the environmental movement's not going to take off until the late 60s and early 70s, Rachel Carson's book kind of gets this on the national agenda. So LBJ's environmental measures are freaking, dude, they rival Teddy's, all right? And we know how much into the environment Teddy was. So here we go. Like I said, guys, he does a lot of stuff. So LBJ is going to, of course, pass the Clean Air Act, which we had already talked about, in order to prevent and control air pollution, set up emission standards for cars. He also passes the Wilderness Act, which helps to preserve large land areas, a Water Resources Research Act to try to find out ways to get most of the existing water resources to avoid or to ease shortages. We also have the Water Quality Act, which strengthens the federal water pollution laws that were already in place. The Highway Beautification Act, which is going to, well, basically beautify the highways, getting rid of like junk and, stuff around the highways. We also have the Endangered Species Act, which is with the Secretary of the Interior to protect stuff like fish and other wildlife. So the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Protection Act protects those endangered species. 35 species of mammals, 30 to 40 species of birds that if we didn't do something, they would probably become extinct. So, birds like the California condor, American bald eagle, don't touch those. They are on that endangered list that's protected. So some of these birds, like the whooping crane, trumpeter swamp prairie chicken, California condor, Kenai moose, Kodiak bear, key deer, fur seal, American bison. So more on environmental stuff. The Air Quality Act, which strengthens the powers of local, state, and federal authorities to combat air pollution. And we also have the National Wilderness Preservation System, which had increased by more than 800,000 acres. So we've got more federally protected lands. So just like FDR, haters gonna hate. And LBJ had his fair share of critics because, come on now. He is greatly expanding the role of government, much like FDR did. And so his greatest critics are going to be conservatives who don't like big government and who don't agree with, his programs to eliminate poverty. So people are going to criticize LBJ for setting up like a welfare state, much like they did with FDR. They criticized FDR for setting up a welfare state too. And, these welfare programs are very costly. A lot of people are thinking they're inefficient. So, yeah, he does have his critics for that. But on the other hand, though, people who support LBJ are like, hey, we needed to do something to help out these marginalized areas of society, to help the poor, the disabled, the elderly. So, LBJ has a great legacy already with the Great Society, but what is going to become his undoing and what he feels just totally undoes his legacy? Because, seriously, if it wasn't for his involvement in the war in Vietnam and how much of a disaster that became, LBJ probably would be in the top 5 presidents ranked by everybody. He would be up there with the likes of like Lincoln and Washington and Teddy and, but his involvement in Vietnam knocks him down a couple of pegs to where he's in the top 10. But still. Now, let's go ahead and talk about probably some of his greatest legacy, though. It's his civil rights measures. So, all right, guys. We're going to roll through this. LBJ's got a lot of civil rights, so brace yourselves. Okay. Whew. All right, there's a lot going on with the civil rights movement with LBJ's presidency, so here we go. So, right after the death of JFK, LBJ hits the ground running as far as to try to get civil rights measures to pass through Congress. So, here he is actively meeting with Martin Luther King Jr. to discuss civil rights legislation. And when Johnson finally takes over, because of, the Kennedy assassination, that's when he's able to steamroll through Congress and get the Civil Rights Act in 1964 passed. This is the same bill that was introduced by JFK in 1963 prior to his assassination, but it had stalled in Congress because JFK doesn't know how to push stuff through Congress. He doesn't have the political savvy that LBJ did. So, plus, he didn't have enough time to push it through. He got assassinated, right? Now, LBJ had already managed to persuade both a majority of Democrats and some Republicans to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64, even before the 1964 election. But he's going to use his influence in Congress to help get it passed. once he became president. And this Civil Rights Act right here, the one in 64, is going to be the defining standard for civil rights bills, because it officially makes segregation illegal in all public facilities, which includes hotels, theaters, restaurants, and gives the federal government additional powers to enforce school desegregation. This is also going to set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which looks at ending racial discrimination or discrimination in general in employment based on race, religion, sex, national origins. So there's also going to be uniform standards for voting. It's going to get rid of literacy tests, which had plagued the African American community, for decades now, and kept them from voting in elections. It's going to just outlaw discrimination in any federally funded program or job, including discrimination based on gender. Here's the thing about the Civil Rights Act of 64. Actually, conservatives added gender to there, if I'm not mistaken, in hopes that it would derail Civil Rights Act of 64, but instead it passed. So, yeah. Nice try. But the Civil Rights Act does so much. So freaking much. Another thing that is gotten rid of is the poll tax. And we get rid of the poll tax through the 24th Amendment. So remember that, guys. Poll tax, 24th Amendment. So this political cartoon that we see here, remember we got rid of slavery with the 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment established citizenship. 15th Amendment, the right to vote for all males. Then 16th Amendment was income tax. 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. 18th Amendment, prohibition, which was repealed by the 21st Amendment. And the 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. So poll tax is the 24th Amendment. And again, trying to help minorities overcome these challenges that they had faced when voting in prior years. So it's still not perfect, though. I mean, there's still much work that needs to be done in the South in order to register minorities to vote. So the Council of Federated Organizations is going to organize the Mississippi Summer Project of 64. And so a lot of Northern white students volunteer for this. They volunteer to register voters in the South, in Mississippi, and to get them to vote for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was it was a departure of the Democratic Party in Mississippi, but of course more aligned to civil rights. So volunteers are going to set up freedom schools in order to try to raise awareness about the inequities of the education system for African Americans. So during this summer, things take a deadly turn. 3 of the volunteers end up missing. We've got Andrew Goldman, we've got James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. So these guys set out to investigate a church bombing near Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they were stopped for a traffic violation. They were held for several hours in jail, and that's the last place anybody saw them alive. Their bodies are found 6 weeks later. The white men were shot once in the chest, but Chaney there is definitely beaten brutally to death. We could tell by the state of his body. But no one's ever convicted of these murders. Everybody knows what happened, but nobody's saying anything. And of course, this is kind of like a Klan thing, right? Or like some other hate organization in the South, in Mississippi at that time. So all white juries refused to bring back a murder conviction, even though everybody knew who did these things. So because of stuff like this, I mean, we see just how bad things are in the South. There's much work that still needs to be done. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference feels that there needs to be more awareness about voting. There needs to be more legislation concerning voting. So they march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama to demand more fairness in voting registration. So, of course, we're going to see all of this on TV. And what we see play out is Bloody Sunday, which we see these peaceful protesters being beaten down by the police. And so people are outraged by what they see on TV. And LBJ himself is like, whoa, this is not good. This is not right. This is not America. So he's going to be persuaded by this to send federal troops to protect Martin Luther King and the marchers as they march across the state. And, you know, God, Bloody Sunday definitely left an impact on the civil rights movement because, I mean, yeah, it just highlights the violence that they faced at every turn. So a second march is organized, but LBJ kind of like tries to get Martin Luther King Jr. to try to like hold off a bit on this, you know, let him pass the Voting Rights Act through Congress. So the younger African Americans, though, are losing patience with this whole nonviolent, peaceful, passive resistant approach. So this is where we start to see young groups like CORE and SNCC start to turn from the nonviolent route to more, you know, Black Power routes. So, because they're tired of getting beat up. I mean, they're the ones getting beat up. They're the ones getting thrown in jail. So they want to punch back. Now, after the killings that happened with the Mississippi Freedom Project and with, well, the Mississippi Summer Project and with Selma and Bloody Sunday, really, LBJ is going to push Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 65. And what the Voting Rights Act of 65 does is authorize the use of federal voting registrars, prevent states from changing their election laws without clearance from the government. So, historically racial states. But that part right there, bullet point number 2, was overturned by the Supreme Court in recent years. So, yeah. States like Texas decided to change their voting laws same day as the Supreme Court decision came out. Yeah, buddy. And the Supreme Court says racism isn't around anymore. That's what they actually said in that decision that overturned this part of the Voting Rights Act. Oh yeah, we don't have racial issues anymore. If you could see my face right now. I swear. Okay, so this prevents the use of literacy tests as a prerequisite from voting, so it further expands what we saw under the Civil Rights Act. So we're going to include state elections now in this stuff as well. So the impact that we feel from this was mostly in the Deep South, where African Americans had been kept from voting. I mean, most definitely. So this is going to really help the African American community gain more voting rights and had more of a foothold in politics. So, like I said, guys, LBJ passes so much civil rights legislation. I mean, dude, he rivals like the Reconstruction civil rights measures and all that. I mean, he does a lot for civil rights. So, here's Malcolm X. Now, whenever you guys approach Malcolm X, you need to compare him to Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. doing the passive, peaceful resistance with the marches, the sit-ins, speeches, and all that. Malcolm X is more about advocating violence to achieve goals. They both want equality, but they've got different means of how to get it. So, Malcolm X is a Black Muslim, Black activist, part of the Nation of Islam. So he's going to preach about Black nationalism, separatism, and self-improvement. So, of course, this is going to attract the younger crowd. And he feels that African Americans should not try to fit into white society. Instead, they should focus on developing their own communities and economic structures. So he kind of takes more of like a Marcus Garvey approach with all that. And he believes in using violence to achieve these goals as necessary. So, you fight back. Which is going to influence groups like the Black Panther Party. So Malcolm X's ideas and more radical approach to civil rights really influences the young African American community. So groups like SNCC and CORE are going to turn more toward this Black Power movement. So Stokely Carmichael, who's the chairman of SNCC, pretty much pushes towards this. He goes against the whole nonviolent aspect, advocates Black power, economic power for the Black community, racial separatism. So in 1966, the Black Panthers are officially formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and others who take the more militant approach to, Black power. They advocate for self-rule for American Blacks, and this is when we start to see these guys wearing the leather jackets, the berets, carrying around the shotguns. So, of course, people like Martin Luther King Jr. see this as going against the movement because, the movement's approach with nonviolent means of achieving their ends is to gain sympathy from society, but society's not going to sympathize with the dude carrying around the shotgun. So, of course, now they're put at odds. And riots happening around the country at the same time, like the Watts riot, is definitely not helping the African American community gain more civil rights. It's just showing the rest of American society the upheaval and the chaos ensuing. But much like in modern times, people were protesting police brutality back then, amongst, the treatment of minorities and such. So, yeah, it's kind of like, this kind of mirrors like what we saw in 2020, guys. Like, seriously, we do have these kind of marches and just people being fed up with what's going on in their end of society. And we see this play out more and more as the 60s roll out. So, during the 7-day period where 34 people were killed, over 1,000 people were injured, and 40 million in property damage, that's when the Watts riots take place in Los Angeles. And another thing that definitely does not help out the movement here is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So, we have Martin Luther King Jr., the guy who is holding the movement together with peaceful, nonviolent measures, is gunned down at his hotel. He does have a rift with LBJ because of Vietnam towards the end here, before he's assassinated, because he feels that the war in Vietnam and our involvement in it drains the Great Society programs, which had been greatly benefiting the African American community. So they butt heads over that. But in April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot down in Memphis, Tennessee. His assassin, James Earl Ray, is arrested and convicted of King's murder. So, the African American community is shattered by this. There's riots that erupt in 168 cities across the country, leaving at least 46 people dead. So, the violence really, God, this is like so against what Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching in the first place. But we could see the frustrations of the African American community boiling up to the surface because of this. In both the South and in the North, because there is a lot of racism and prejudice up north as well. So, the violence definitely has a negative impact on the civil rights movement. White backlash is a thing at this time. White blue-collar voters are so anti-civil rights because of this. And it's going to be reflected in the 1968 election. So I think we're going to end here, guys, because, dude, there's still so much LBJ to cover. So next time around, we're going to go with the Supreme Court and see how the Warren Court addresses issues of the rights of the rights of the accused, and of additional civil liberty measures. Plus, we're going to see the counterculture, and we're going to talk about LBJ's foreign policy, which includes the war on Vietnam and other rights movements. I'm telling you guys, LBJ has a lot going on in his presidency, so, whew. All right. I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.